Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leading with Agility, the show that uses the world around us to explore how leadership can be inspired by agility. I'm your regular host, Arif, and I'm joined by...
myself, TK, the coach that has plenty of reminders.
Thanks, TK. And another episode with another special guest. And we're joined today by Jag Johal, a Senior Transformation Director at Jaguar Land Rover, also known as JLR. Thank you, Jag, for joining us. We're excited to have you with us today. For our listeners who probably aren't aware or familiar with you, would you mind introducing yourself briefly to them, and then we'll kick off our episode?
Sure. Thank you for having me on this episode today. I'm really looking forward to it. So, Jag Johal, currently leading our Agile Transformation at JLR. I have been for the last few years. It has been a really fascinating journey with lots of ups, but some downs as well. And I guess with quite a strong people lens, given my sort of HR background, the leadership aspect of it has been sort of really fundamental to a lot of our thought process that's going through it. So really interested to see how this conversation can sort of build some of those themes and connect them together a little bit, hopefully, for people listening in.
Nice. Thank you, Jag, for that wonderful introduction and segue into our episode today. On that leadership point, and I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about and avenues to explore. But maybe, I think as a starting point, I'd like to ask this of our guests. What I suppose does leadership mean to you in the context of everything going on at JLR at the moment and the transformation you're experiencing? How would you describe what's important when it comes to leadership from your point of view?
I think the critical thing for me is around creating the right environment for people to be brilliant. So I can see some amazing people with industry-leading abilities and capability that they've built over time, either have been with us as JLR for some time or have joined us more recently. But for me, the role of a leader always has been creating the environment that means those people can work together in a way that drives brilliant outcomes from a business perspective. Really clear, really tangible. People know what is being asked of them. They've been given the space to go and do that work. So that at the end of a week, they can go home or meet friends or whatever it might be, and they can talk about work that they have delivered and are proud of and can talk to the value of it. That then drives their motivation and a sense of achievement and value that they hold in terms of their career. So it becomes a bit of a broader philosophy almost in terms of building people's capability in the four walls of an organisation. Why I think the role of a leader is so critical in creating that environment, but one I think that is becoming ever more challenged with just mounting external challenges, pressures, change upon change, etc., which might sound a little bit on vogue at the moment. You hear lots of people talking about it, but it is the reality of what lots of leaders are facing into. And leading people, I would honestly say, is a really difficult skill.
Yeah, no, I love your answer. Thank you. And I love the picture you painted about going home at the end of the week as well. I think that's quite a nice overall, way of thinking about it. That how the motivation, the engagement that you expect to see from employees. I know before coming on today's episode, and we've talked a bit about what we might want to explore on the show today. Some of it is around your own personal journey, and you mentioned the HR background of yours, and I think it would be nice if we could start there and explore some of that. And maybe if you want to paint another picture about what drew you from that HR background into the role you're in now, and maybe, I suppose, on a broader level as well, this idea of looking after people and having a people focus. How does that connect to agility, maybe as well? I don't know if there's something to explore there. to kick us off.
Yeah. So ostensibly, up until about 3-4 years ago, my background was from a sort of people and HR perspective, working across a number of different areas, working in both more industrial ER type space, as well as some of the more office based, some global experience in there as well. So that gave me a great grounding. And I guess where I find myself today was not necessarily part of any strategic career plan. It was probably a bit opportunistic at a point in which the organisation was starting to think about this journey into the world of Agile. I just sort of happened to be in the right place, involved in a few of the right conversations, with someone saying, "Here's something that I think is developing. We don't quite know what it is. Is this something you kind of want to put your head under the bonnet of and explore a bit further?" Really simply, if you can create a working system that allows people to be brilliant and reduce the friction and take out the waste that you see, for them to be able to do their work, and they live in an environment that they want to be part of, and love being part of, and would advocate it to others. Well, that's something I'd love to be. That's something I'd love to be part of. I don't quite know what it is, but let's go explore it. And the curious bit of me was interested to go find out a bit more
about this curiosity, because this is actually quite curious, and I'm sure that some of the people listening to us do work with, let's call them Agile practitioners, right? So people coming from the journey that you've described, developers, Scrum Masters, etc. But what I'm wondering is, what you described is, as you say, quite brilliant, and I think I would agree with a lot of it. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, Jag, when you see, and I'm sure that you're, obviously collaborating with many Agile practitioners, what is it that in your journey that you think others are missing? What's the blind spot that they have, but you don't because of where you came from?
Very interesting question. So my view, the way I would see it, is taking the principles or the practices that practitioners will hold, and being able to really translate it into tangible actions and things that will make a business better. So I guess one of the things I've seen and been involved in and learned over the last few years has been, I hear lots of people talk about an agile mindset as an example.
Yeah, popular term.
And I get the concept. My challenge constantly is, what does that mean in practice? How do I take an agile mindset concept and improve a business result as a consequence? And how would a business leader know that we have improved a business outcome because we now have an agile mindset, whatever that is? Probably a different conversation for another day.
So quickly, how would you describe it then? This could be quite interesting to some of our listeners.
So I think for me, again, I come from quite a simple place in many respects. For me, it's about, first and foremost, getting underneath the skin of understanding what the business problem is. What's the thing you're trying to solve and make better? And then being open-minded and curious enough to kind of figure out different ways of looking at how that problem might get solved. Being, I think, humble enough to know that you probably don't have the answer, but you can help facilitate the answer. Or certainly draw in expertise, think about things in a much more experimental way. So, one of the big things I've been learning is very much about try things quickly, but not just try things quickly, be able to have proof points. What's the data that's telling you? I think, lots of people around me would recognize themes emerging from me consistently with them about data. And evidence of development or betterment. How do we know? How would we translate that into not agile terms, but doing things that the business would understand in their terms and in their language, that makes it translatable and easy for them to understand? And I think that's a little bit of the challenge I guess I've seen with practitioners, which is trying to really land some of what I can see they're trying to say, but it's all got a bit caught up maybe in terminology and language that a business is struggling to understand, and therefore it creates a little bit of a tension and a friction point, when in reality they're all saying the same thing, but they're just coming from it in different lenses. So it's maybe thinking about it in more operational terms, I guess, which is where I come from, because I've always been taught to think about what's the challenge the business is trying to face, and how do we lean into that to help support whatever that might be.
So I'm listening to that. I think, Jag, when you talk about data and evidence, I wanted to add something there around. We did an episode in our last season around evidence-based management, or we touched on that. Tika, you may remember. And one of the things that we were discussing there, and some of the thinking that we were bringing in around a lack of leaders who, or leaders who lack the ability, I suppose, to make decisions based on data evidence, but instead make their decisions based on what they feel is the right thing to do, or what they believe to be the right thing. I wonder, how prevalent do you think that still is, or is in your world at JLR? Is it something that's diminishing? Is it still a challenge? How would you kind of quantify it from your perspective?
We have lots of information, I guess, as a fundamentally an organization that has stemmed from an engineering or manufacturing base in years gone by. We're not short of data. What I think we're still on a journey of is, how do we use that to create insight, and therefore use the insight to inform
new decisions.
Yeah. And like lots of companies, we're constantly grappling with how to connect bits of data and where it feeds from, and sources of truth, etc., etc. Yeah. So, and I hear and I speak to lots of people who are also, trying to figure all of that out.
Do you think that leaders lack any skill or capability in making that transition to do that more, or is it, what would you put it down to, if you from the experiences you've had? I'm curious about that.
I think the bit I would go to that I see challenge on is actually in the planning phase. I think planning as a skill and an art is actually undervalued, and being able to use data and measurement to enable your planning, and therefore to assess whether your plans have been successful or not, is something I think that I hear, again, lots of organisations really trying to still grapple with, taking big ideas, concepts, and then trying to translate that into distinct work that thousands of people will now go do, is really, really hard, actually. And I think people underestimate how difficult that can be, particularly when you start getting to these concepts of self-managing teams. That the thing I've been grappling with a lot over a few years is, I kind of get that when there's sort of about 3 teams all sat in a garage in a startup trying to figure how to build the next app that is going to make them multimillionaires. But when you're talking across a system that has hundreds, if not thousands, that's really, really difficult to manage the flow of work, all of the dependencies that come off the back of it. Who is needing whose support? Where do you prioritise resource or funding? And that's why I keep coming back to the planning bit as a real skill, to really being able to create clarity for people, for them to go and self-manage their work. So you're then giving them the ability to say, right, we've got the clarity, you're the experts, now you go and do the work and tell us how best to do this, because that isn't for us to do it.
All right, but wait. Some people actually, which is interesting, because you've mentioned the planning phase, and I agree with you, right? As you said, in an organization like yours, in a process like yours, there's probably a clear need for what you've described as a planning phase. Although, I'm sure that you've heard some agile practitioners saying that so much upfront planning is well, not necessarily conducive to agility. And I'm just wondering, what do you guys do to make sure that, you still have the, as you described it, the agile mindset, the agile values, while being able to plan?
It's a careful balancing act, I would say, and one that I think we're still learning on how to really be very good at it. And I think I see we're at different stages. I think across again quite a big landscape. But I think the bit that I see as a real increasing strength of ours is the levels of collaboration that I now start to see, and the identification of critical path type of activity. So I have this debate quite a lot, and again, it's been part of my own learning, which is around, as you said, TK, we should be free from upfront copious amounts of planning that says by this date we need to have done this, etc., etc. For us, I think it is a bit of a balance because we're trying to integrate so many different bits of work together to formulate a particular product.
Yeah.
What it really requires is people working together to understand how do all of those bits come together at a point in time, which has some very practical considerations for us, in terms of delivering something that needs to go into a factory, for example.
It sounds like there's a constant conversation of compromise needing to happen, right? In order to get such a complex product out the door with all the constraints that you have. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the way I always describe it is that the whole construct we've got is a series of compromises because you have so many different people. Life isn't going to be perfect for everyone. Again, I go back to if it was you and 3 others in your garage working on your app 15 hours a day, you've only got 4 people to communicate to. You can make it easy.
That does lead to then questions about org design, org structure, and going back to where we started around leadership as well and their role. I'm sure. But we can before we get into that in a bit more detail. I think it's time for a break. So let's go for a break now, and then we'll come back and see if we want to explore some of those points and maybe some other more interesting things around servant leadership too. So let's see you after the break. Thank you. Our next webinar will be coming your way on November the 19th, live on LinkedIn. We'll be joined by Chris O'Sullivan, a leader with over 20 years of experience in workplace well-being, to discuss how leaders can better protect their mental health. He'll share practical strategies to help leaders build resilience and thrive under pressure. To register, visit our website, scroll to the bottom of the homepage, and hit that sign up button. See you there. Welcome back, everyone. And as I was saying before the break, we were discussing with Jag some of the compromises, challenges being faced at JLR when it comes to managing work and trying to apply an agile approach. We also touched on, Jag, at the end there around org structure, design, and the role of leaders. I think on that point of role of leaders, with all the work that you've been doing to, create this new way of working and make that the norm, I should say, at the organization, what were the maybe top 1 or 2 challenges you faced from leaders when initially trying to get this new way of working out there, or even suggesting that this is a way forward? How would you categorize those, maybe?
One, definitely about change. First and foremost, this was quite a significant shift in terms of a way of working. And I would say we didn't invest enough in the process of change and really engaging people in the process. So we're really helping people understand the why what are the benefits we're trying to do, through to do you really want to be part of this?
Right. Okay.
And being brave enough to kind of ask those questions. So
yeah,
because that way you're creating the ownership across a leadership group, which I think is critical in any big change management program. So and as a consequence, we've therefore had some challenges and people asking why we do this, or we're not quite sure, or I'm still lacking a bit of clarity on how this is working, through to actually I'm just completely confused, Jake, and I don't know what we're doing. And it all feels really mucky. And that probably has been our ongoing challenge, I think, throughout the work we've been doing. And you realise just how complex a set of stakeholders we have to be able to manage all of those in a way that I think we ideally should.
Yeah. And in that experience that you've had, I'm sure for you as a leader yourself as well, that's been a massive learning journey. How would you, I suppose, or what were your learnings in that experience of trying to then generate that buy-in or create the right atmosphere to make change more conducive? How did you do that, and how did it maybe affect you as well from a leadership perspective?
I would say this has been one of the hardest things I've ever done, and it's been one of the steepest learning curves I think I've had, if not the steepest learning curve in my career, which has been hugely challenging and at the same time quite daunting, and difficult to manage from a personal perspective, because on many days I would question my own capability of doing this, and are there not actually more experienced agile practitioners who probably should be sat in these shoes rather than me, etc. So and that's been a constant thing I've had to work through. The biggest thing for me was getting organised. So being able to really understand, again, what is it we're trying to do, have a plan that allows us to actively then manage that, I think has been one of the really critical things. I know for myself, and it's one of the biggest things I've learned over the last few years, is I do have an inherent curiosity. I do like to go dig, and I'm constantly asking questions about why this, and we could do that. And so I'm constantly churning out ideas. One of the things I think that has been a huge learning curve for me has been not everyone I work with, in fact, lots of people that I work with don't have that same thought process, and actually what they crave is a degree of stability and consistency of direction. And I was flip-flopping quite a lot, which is then difficult for some people to really understand where we're going on this change thing, because every time I talk to you, Jag, you've got a new great idea, and the idea is great, but there's 4 ideas that were also great that you haven't yet done much with. So and that causes people to question, where are we going? And that's definitely been one of the biggest things I've been working through over the last couple of years, of actually, I need to contain my own natural desires for having brilliant, as I would see them brilliant, but they may not always be brilliant, ideas and thoughts and big picture thinking, to something that is actually drives a level of consistency, actually delivers some things and then builds upon them. So you're giving people confidence in the sense of direction you're going in. And I struggle with that to a certain degree over
and
time.
I know it's especially when it comes to, like, if agility is the name of the game, it must be a difficult one to, on one hand, bring this sense of stability. My question is, when you have these conversations and you have someone that really yearns for stability, do you use any techniques? Would you recommend anything that other practitioners might do? Is there a story to tell of an interesting encounter?
I think the biggest thing is probably with the team I work with. Feedback from them, and I think that was probably my real starting point, actually, which is getting live and direct feedback and making sure that people felt comfortable to give that feedback. which I think was interesting in the very early days, where that probably wasn't quite the case, which surprised me a little bit, because I thought I was creating an environment where people could say, Jag, I really don't think that's a very good idea. So the use of and the appreciation of feedback, from my perspective, has grown infinitely, to then really take it on board and go, now what would I do with it? And I might not always do something with it straight away, because again, it will sometimes take me a bit of time to think about what I want to do with it, or engage others to help me think it through. And then breaking things down into really simple bite-sized chunks. Again, I think I was sometimes guilty of trying to draw a narrative of something that existed in the future that I thought was brilliant and people got excited about. But what we were struggling with is then, so how do I get to that, Jag? What do you need us to do that would allow us to get to step 1, then to step 2, then to step 3? So we're still on that journey, if I'm honest, but I think we've started to break some of that down.
It was interesting listening to you talk about that and your experience there, Jag, is your openness around your own limits there, and where you're realizing it's being pushed from a leadership point of view. I think that's quite nice to hear. So thank you for sharing that. It's not always easy, and it does bring to me our next point we wanted to talk about on today's episode, around this idea of servant leadership. And I know, again, beforehand we've touched on this briefly, and there's a challenge for us around, does it work? Does it not work? And let's get into that. But why I'm bringing up the servant leadership point here is, I think what you're highlighting or touching on is, how does a leader, or the question I suppose in my head is, how does a leader create that environment where they're comfortable with that unknownness, that being challenged, excuse me, unknownness, being challenged, having to maybe act in a different leadership stance, where they are expected to know all answers and expected to be directing the team all the time with everything what needs to happen, whereas in this servant leadership stance, maybe being slightly the opposite in some respects. I mean, that must be a difficult transition for any leader, but I mean, what are the challenges that you've observed in that type of leadership stance, or even in that example you've given us, where you've been a bit open about your limits and where you've been challenged? How have you managed to bring the two together? I suppose this idea of servant leadership and maybe knowing where to go next sometimes.
I think the key bit for me is the people around you. So to come at this together as a team, not you having to think that you need to be the person to come up with everything, and the solutions and the plan and the cascade of it. So using the skills and the people around you. And again, some of this was, I guess, even more heightened for me, because go back to the sort of earlier part. My background is not as an Agile practitioner, but what I leaned into were now the team that we were building, who are Agile practitioners and do have experience in other organisations of doing this type of activity, or who have come from being Scrum Masters or Agile coaches in different parts of in different organisations. And really, I think the thing for me was recognising what are my own strengths and how do I leverage them for the benefit of the team. But where do I know it's not my preference, let's put it that way. I think that's often what I speak to people about. This is not what you're good or bad at. It's each of us will have preferences of where we prefer to play. And then leaning in where I know I've got areas that aren't necessarily the thing I enjoy the most, let's put it that way. But I do know there are people in the team who absolutely do and have immense capability in that space. And using them to help collectively then drive a solution. So again, at one point I did sort of think this was all sat on my shoulders and needed to come up with every single answer. And I, again, got myself into a little bit of a sort of, tight corner. And it was at the point I started to really leverage the team actively engage them, that again was a bit uncomfortable, because they, through that process, they then started to ask more open questions about, well, why this, and why is this not happening, and should we not do that? And I'm like, I don't know, or tried to answer when I probably shouldn't have actually answered. But I think knowing yourself is the really critical bit. Knowing which bits actually make you up and are the brilliant bits of you, and there are brilliant bits that everyone holds. But then also being, I guess, self-aware enough and humble enough to know that these are the bits I need help on. Because actually, sat around me are people with greater levels of capability in that space. Now put the thing together, well, then we start to get somewhere. And we're still on that journey. That's the thing I would definitely say. We're not there yet by any stretch of the imagination.
I'm sure there's a journey. But, and again, it's a difficult one. And I can totally recognize the fact that being able to ask for it and being able to notice it is a difficult one. But in an organization that, obviously evolved over the years and is quite something that's established, it's not often easy to ask for help. It's not often easy to admit, as you said, to these things that you want help with, right? That you might not have the brilliance there just yet. So how do you do it in your team? What's the technique there?
I think I go back a little bit to, I suppose, what I was saying somewhere near the start, which is what's the thing we're trying to solve? What's the challenges we've got in front of us? And can we be clear on that? Which I think, again, is something we're getting better at, again, collectively as a team. And then open up the opportunity for people to be part of it. So one of the things I do and try to do more of is, if there is a particular bit of work and something that we've now identified, it's an open invitation for people who want to be involved. So it's your chance to come in and give us a voice and share your experience or expertise or your passion for a particular subject, rather than me going, right, you do this and you do that, and directing. Is trying to find a balance, and this isn't the case all the time, but here are things that we're trying to do, and I openly encourage lots of you to get involved, because what that also does is it brings a real diversity of thought, which is for me really, really important. Yes. I've got people not just quote unquote agile practitioners, but I've got operational people, I've got people with a JLR background, I've got people with a change background. That then creates a great melting pot of ideas that get thrown around, which that in itself can cause some challenges, because then you're stuck there going, right, now which one of these do we go with? So managing that diversity of thought is also not quite as easy as some people like to think it is.
Absolutely isn't. And, we actually, Arif, you probably would acknowledge the fact. I remember when we had a meeting with a client quite recently, when we had to choose a team that did best out of the teams. And our client was quite surprised, because we came in without pre-preparation in terms of an aligned party line, and we actually debated it in front of the client. Arif was actually kicking me underneath the table. So I'm just wondering, Jack, if you have so much diversity of thought with all these backgrounds, how do you deal with that using the servant leadership mindset?
Again, I guess somewhere it's a balance. So what I would always come to the position of is somewhere in the role of a servant leader is the word leader, and implied within that is the requirement to make a decision. So yes, building people's thoughts in embracing that diversity, really being there to support the team, in its purest definition. But there is also a need sometimes that you're going to have to step in and make a call, because there's such a diversity of thought, or there's just different, there's a couple of different camps.
So how does a servant leader know when is that to happen, right? It's a difficult one. And I know you could say it's a balance that we need to strike, but how do you know when to step in these situations?
I guess the bit I kind of spot, or try to spot, is when are we now starting to go around a little bit in circles? The conversation started to become a bit similar. We're starting to raise the same points, or there might be frustrations bubbling up in some people because, they themselves are feeling like, I keep saying this thing, but we seem to be going round and round in circles. And, are we actually ever going to do something as a consequence? So I think there are little patterns that you spot in how the group are acting, or the conversation that's occurring, or within individuals, which are then at some point there's a judgment call, I believe, to say, okay, let's take 5 minutes. I think I've heard lots of things, and let me just play something back to you of what I've heard. So often what I try to do is take it from a lens of, this is my experience and what I have observed, which I own, you don't, so you can't debate it per se. And let me just play something back, and does this now make sense? And that's what I try to get to. And again, it won't come across as I've now listened, and we are now going to do this. Again, I try to do it in a way which is suggestive, which says, from everything I've heard and my own view, which I also think is important, this, as a servant leader, it doesn't mean you stay silent. You have an expertise that you need to lean into as well. But I think it feels like we're gravitating towards decision A and decision B. Has some challenges. Does that feel like where we're getting to as a group? So you're kind of trying to nudge and nurdle the group to a decision and not be the diktat of it, as much as you possibly can. But the things, again, I've wrestled with a bit as someone who naturally is, I guess, has a collaborative style. There are times where I have had to, and had to make myself step in a little bit more and be a bit more affirmative in a decision or a stance, or almost maybe a little bit pokey or spiky myself, to enable a decision to be made and move forward, which ultimately may not be the right one, but allows us to move. Otherwise we get stuck.
But I think what you're demonstrating there, Jag, is a collaborative approach to decision making. Something, GK, we are quite strong advocates of ourselves, and having a more participatory, if that's the word, approach to decision making within a team setting. And I'm sure, Jag, you'll agree, or you can add your own thoughts around how that impacts team engagement / motivation as well, and team members' desire or ability to then engage. I'm sure you can add some to that, but that I like what you've described there in that setting, regard of around that style of leadership. I was wondering, as we kind of head towards the end of today's episode, Jag, and thinking from our listeners' point of view, and thinking about takeaways for them and things that they can maybe go in and implement, perhaps. How, I suppose, what would be, one or two things that, from a behavioral point of view or leadership behavioral point of view, you would say are really important that leaders implement or try to implement in their own leadership style to move them towards this way of leading that you've been describing? If you can distill it into something actionable, that would be great as well.
I'll try. You've just given me sort of a doctorate essay title.
Sorry.
No, it's a great question. I think, again, probably I go back to something I guess I was maybe talking about at the start, which is really being self-aware about what impacts you and your behaviours are having, and to the extent that the thing I guess I've learned is there are some things I didn't think I was doing, but clearly were being interpreted in a way which was quite uncomfortable at the beginning when I started to do this, because it wasn't my intention. Really, generally wasn't, but something clearly wasn't being communicated or landing in a way that was thinking about it. So I often talk to people about being really clear about what's your intent, and then actually what is the impact, and are the two matching or are the two different, and getting the feedback loop to get in place of, is the impact now aligning to your intent, or actually have you got a gap? as a way of kind of really trying to understand the environment you're creating as kind of, point number one, I suppose. And point number two, I come back to this point about planning, really helping people to get clarity. So again, back to this challenge of don't spend weeks and months upfront planning to then see it fall over at the first challenge you have within sort of a few days, but find that balance that really does give people clarity for them to go then do brilliant work. Whereas again, I think, it was, for me, that's where empowerment really comes into this, which says that it's a very easy word to throw about, but you have to create the right conditions for empowerment to succeed. And it isn't just behavioural. I believe there are some structural elements to empowerment that for it to really work, i.e. people need to know the boundaries in which they are empowered, what are the things that they need to do, by when. So they themselves can actually structure their work and how they go about it. Whereas if it's a bit too loose and free, it becomes difficult for them to know what does good look like. So those are probably the two things I would probably say that would resonate with me anyway. So.
I appreciate that, and thank you for sharing that. It does connect back to where we started with this conversation around servant leadership. If we go back to, so for our listeners, and if you want to know more, this is a concept that's been around since the 70s, originated by a chap named Robert Greenleaf, and he describes in a similar way to how you have, Jag, as around it being primarily about the growth and well-being of people and the communities to which they belong, which I think chimes quite nicely, rather than more traditional leadership, as you've also described as well, being about as he described, the accumulation and exercise of power.
Which we also talked about,
we should talk about. So it's a huge difference between the two. So thank you for illuminating all of your thoughts with us today around leadership and the journey of change that you've been going on at JLR. TK, did you want to add anything as we head towards the end here to summarize any thoughts?
I think, what the balance between, servant leadership, but on the other hand, I think creating the atmosphere where, and the environment when people can openly speak and give feedback, is the most important thing. And, this, again, as Jack said, it's in the details, even though sometimes it's difficult, but a leader has to step in, right? And when people are going in circles, that's just important. And again, another takeaway for me is this acknowledgement of the feeling of stability that many people need. So that's me.
Thank you. Well, we'll pause there, and thank you once again, Jag, for joining us. It's been a pleasure hearing from you and discussing all your experiences. Thanks, TK, as well. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for another episode. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. And as always, if you did, then please like or subscribe to the show. And if you haven't already, then do leave a review. Always helps us with the algorithms. And we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. And we'll see you at our next episode very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.